Evening, and this is going to be a little different than our previous lecture formats. Someone asked me if I could expound further on the fourth commandment, which is to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And I thought about going ahead with some lectures that I had prepared in the past and preached from, but I thought I'm going to take some already existing works and I'm going to read from them. If you don't enjoy listening to someone doing an audio or a book reading, this won't be fun for you. However, if you really are interested in the doctrine of the Sabbath, I'm only going to glean from men who had a firm grasp on the teachings as well as have stood the test of time. The curious thing to me is how universally the Puritans during their day held to the Sabbath without hardly any variance. There were always some that were on the fringe, but they understood it to be so critical. And yet in today's society, somehow the church has evolved and gotten so much smarter, or we've gotten some new revelation or some new knowledge from the Lord that no preachers of days gone by had ever discovered. And so their view on the Christian Sabbath changed greatly. They've diminished it, if you will, and made it something that it is not. So with that said, J.C. Ryle made the statement, as the Sabbath goes, so goes the church. And I would agree with that. The day that the church has made the determination that there's 9 commandments and actually not 10, and it always seems to be the Sabbath that gets kicked to the curb, is the day that the church will see itself dwindling in importance and vitality in the community. This day is not something that we chose, but something that God gifted to us. So I'm going to read from a book. These lectures are going to be shorter. I'm not going to do a full 30 minutes. I'm going to do around 15 minutes, so it should be a little bit easier. I had a couple of people say it was a little bit difficult for them to get through their day and sit down and listen to a 30-minute lecture at the end of the day without being able to interact, because it was a sleepy time for them. And my teaching tends to do that. It gives people great peace, and they fall right asleep. So let me read from a book called, it's by Increase Mather, and it's actually a portion of the sermons, of a sermon he preached to his church. Increase Mather, in case you're wondering, was born on June the 21st, 1639. I was born on June the 9th, so that's a good month. He died in 1723. He was one of the, known as the last Puritans of the New England ministers. He was the son of Richard Mather, father who was and he was the father of the more famous Mather, which was Cotton Mather. He was educated at Harvard and at Dublin. Later, he became president of Harvard College. He became one of the most prolific writers of the 17th and 18th centuries in New England, only to be outdone by his son, Cotton Mather. He is better known as the pastor of the Second Church in Boston, for which he served for over 50 years. He was a faithful and a powerful minister of the gospel. The following is a substance of the sermon that was preached in the Second Church of Boston, August 1712, regarding the doctrine and application of the Christian Sabbath or the Lord's Day. As the sermon was needed in the 18th century, so it is needed in our day. The doctrine of the Lord is an oft-neglected teaching and practice. While all that Pastor Mather says upon the topic may not be received, yet his sermon is being read in hopes that it will cause us to examine our hearts and practice in a most holy duty. So let's get started with the preface that he wrote himself. It has been disputed whether the observation of the Christian Sabbath is a divine or only an ecclesiastical institution. The schoolmen, generally popish casuists, make it to be a mere human ordinance, denying the morality of the fourth commandment, with whom some prelaic Protestants such as Hellion, Ironside, Pocklington, and Francis White, who is the Bishop of Ely, with others concur. And there is a paragraph in Calvin's Institute which seems to look at it that way. That book of his is an admirable composure. I remember that many years ago I read this distich on it. He wrote in his youth, when he was 26 years old. Afterwards, upon second thoughts, being arrived to a greater maturity of judgment, he declares himself after a different manner than what he said in the institutions. In his commentary on Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3, he said that the consecration of one day in 7 is a perpetual equity unto which all men in all ages are obliged. And he has a like passage in his commentary on the 4th commandment. There is then no reason to reflect on that great man, so as some have done, on the account of an obscure expression in one of his first books, from which one of his excellent successors in Geneva has vindicated him, showing that Calvin has been misunderstood in that passage, at which many have taken offense. But that the devoting one day in 7 to the Creator of the world and the author of time is a moral and therefore immutable precept. It has been with great learning and solidity solidly evinced. As the divines of other nations have argued, even the divines of our own nation, New England has cause to honor, for that he was eminently serviceable in promoting the settlement of this colony, speaking of Mr. White. Also, Mr. Nathaniel Eaton, the first president of the college in Cambridge, did in the year 1633, under the presidency of Dr. Ames, published an excellent dissertation asserting the morality of the Sabbath. 'Tis a sad thought that such a man should become an apostate, and in his latter days a persecutor of good men, and at last die in prison, but not for his religion. There are those who make the morality of the 4th commandment to consist in the observation of the 7th day of the week, endeavoring, like the old Ebionites, to reduce Christians to a Jewish Sabbath. 80 years ago, John Trask made a disturbance in England with that opinion, and more lately, Mr. Bampfield occasioned some trouble of reviving that error. I had, above 50 years ago, the happiness of an intimate acquaintance with that reverend, aged, and singularly pious servant of the Lord, Mr. William Benn, who was a pastor of a church in Dorchester, and whom I can never think of without love and honor. He has answered all Mr. Bampfield's allegations with great candor and solidity of judgment. I have not, in what is emitted herewith, thought it worth the while to reply to the objections of Jewish Sabbatarians. It is done by the authors mentioned above, and by Mr. Baxter and Mr. Young and Mr. Cowdery and Mr. Shepherd have proved the change from the Sabbath from the last of the 7 to the first of the 7 days in the week, where readers may find further satisfaction. It must be owned that the Lord's Day is better observed in Britain than in any other nation, and, notwithstanding our degeneracy, is in New England with greater strictness than in most parts of England, and much more religiously than in any of the outgoings of the nations. Nevertheless, it might and ought to be kept after a more holy manner than by many it is. And it is much to be desired that for the future there may be no townships or precincts settled unless by such and are both willing and able to uphold the public worship of God, without which the Lord's Day cannot duly be sanctified, and that the inhabitants may not live at such a distance from one another as that it must necessity travel 6 or 7 miles to enjoy the ordinances of the gospel. May this publication be any way conducing to prevent judgments and obtain blessings, I have my design therein, which is by establishing the doctrine of the Christian Sabbath, to promote piety and practical religion, which does very much consist in the due sanctification of the Lord's Day. Boston, September 8th, 1712, Increase Mather. Join me tomorrow evening, and I will begin the first portion called Remember the Sabbath Day to Keep It Holy.